the glamorous life of a medieval soldier, where job security was excellent until it wasn't. Healthcare was basically a priest with a bucket, and the retirement plan mostly involved an unmarked grave. War back then wasn't some grand, honourable spectacle. It was a mess of mud, blood, and some pretty questionable hygiene choices. But don't worry, it wasn't all dark and gloomy. There was also starvation, exhaustion, and the ever-present possibility of catching a medieval disease that made battle wounds seem like a minor inconvenience. So get ready to step into the very uncomfortable, very smelly boots of a medieval soldier to experience what life was really like on the front lines. All right, let's say we have baseball season, football season, or Netflix season, and of course, Wobbit season. But guess what? Back in medieval times, they had something far less cozy: campaign season. No, this wasn't the time to put up posters and spit on your neighbours. This was when knights and soldiers packed their bags, kissed their families goodbye, or maybe just nodded and grunted, and marched off to wage war. Anyways, since medieval warfare mostly happened outdoors, generals waited for decent weather before getting their troops together. No one wanted to march through a blizzard, only to end up fighting a guy whose nuts were too frozen to lift his sword. Battles usually took place between planting and harvesting seasons, because, apparently, people liked to keep their food supply intact. You know, tiny priorities. And fighting in warm weather had a few perks. More food for men and horses, less firewood needed, and fewer muddy roads that turned battlefields into medieval slip and slides. However, there were some downsides. Let's take William the Conqueror in 1066, for example. He gathered his men in the summer, ready to conquer England. But guess what? The wind said, nah. They were stuck waiting for months, while King Harold's men, who were already on edge, had to go home for the harvest. Not great for England, but perfect for William. Now, if you think medieval warfare was a boys-only club, you're wrong. Some soldiers packed up their entire families and dragged them along. Yup, that's right, wives, of course. They needed some action. Besides, they brought in their kids and even mothers-in-law, 'cause nothing says boosts male morale like your mother-in-law yelling at you to stand up straight. It was like a medieval road trip, except for the fact that you'd be dodging arrows the whole time. This was especially common during the Crusades, when thousands of Europeans marched toward Jerusalem like they were going on an ill-planned group tour. Some aristocratic women even joined in, including Richard the Lionheart's wife, who married him in Cyprus in 1191 and thought, hey, why don't we have our thing in the battlefield? Well, fortunately for Richard the Lionheart, she wasn't there for long, though. Turns out medieval battles weren't exactly a honeymoon destination. But bringing the fam along wasn't all sunshine and victory parades. Peter the Hermit's crew, for instance, ran into some Turkish fighters in Constantinople, who promptly attacked their tents and wiped out anyone they found, including women and children. Maybe next time, just send a postcard. Now let's walk through weapons. You see, medieval weapons weren't designed to gently put your enemy to sleep. These things were made to kill, maim, and make sure you'd regret ever stepping onto the battlefield with your wife. And one more thing, not every wound was instantly fatal. If you were lucky, you'd just walk away with a gnarly scar and maybe some lifelong brain damage. Fun. Archaeologists have found skeletons from battles like the one at Towton in 1461, showing all sorts of creative ways medieval soldiers met their end. Swords, maces, and axes left deep cuts, crushed skulls, and holes in bones. It wasn't uncommon for knights to get knocked off their horses and trampled either. Just imagine going through years of training only to be flattened by your own side's cavalry. Medieval battle reports didn't sugarcoat things either. After the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English soldiers carried their wounded away, while French fighters crawled off into the woods, where many, well, didn't make it. So, basically, if you were in medieval warfare, your survival strategy boiled down to either being absurdly good at fighting or just being really, really lucky. One thing I wanted to specifically mention was the fact that Hollywood makes medieval war horses look like majestic beasts straight out of a fantasy novel, giant muscular creatures thundering into battle. But want to know the reality? They weren't that dramatic. Researchers found that most war horses were about the size of a modern pony. That's right. Knights weren't galloping into battle on massive steeds. They were charging in on what were essentially jacked-up Shetland ponies. But before you start picturing knights toppling over because their horses were too tiny, remember that these horses were still strong and well-bred for combat. They just weren't the giant war machines movies make them out to be. So, basically, imagine Jean-Claude Van Damme, but in horse form, short, muscular, and not to be underestimated. Next, you'd think medieval soldiers had extensive boot camps, right? Turns out, not so much. Most training came from everyday activities. Hunting helped with archery skills, farming built up endurance, and let's say bar fights. Well, those probably helped too. Knights, on the other hand, did get some structured training. Tournaments were a popular way to practice, but they weren't exactly safe. Case in point, Duke Leopold V of Austria was killed in a jousting accident in 1194. That's like getting a fatal injury during a game of dodgeball. Not exactly the glorious battlefield death he was probably hoping for. Unlike the neatly uniformed armies of later centuries, medieval soldiers wore whatever they had. That meant some knights rode into battle fully armored, while others looked like they just threw on their underpants. If you were broke, you fought in whatever scraps you could afford. And if you were really unlucky, that might just be a tunic and some wishful thinking. Besides, did you know the medieval armies also had to bring their own food? Yup, Charlemagne, the famous ruler of the Franks, even gave his soldiers a medieval shopping list of essentials: shield, lance, sword, dagger, bow, and a quiver of arrows. But when food ran out, the soldiers just took what they needed from local villages. This was called foraging, which is a fancy way of saying stealing with a couple of extra steps. Now, soldiers in the medieval era were expected to bring more than just their wives and guts for stabbing people in the name of their lord. They had to be walking, talking Home Depots, equipped with axes, planes, augers, boards, spades, iron shovels, and whatever else they needed to turn the battlefield into a medieval construction site. And if that wasn't enough, they were also required to bring 3 months' worth of food, and enough clothing to last them half a year. But hey, it wasn't all bad. If modern video games have taught us anything, it's that after a battle, you loot the bodies. These guys were pretty much playing medieval Grand Theft Auto, where the objective was to strip fallen men of their armor, weapons, and anything shiny. Sometimes they'd even go for a high score by looting entire villages. Of course, the whole thing wasn't always a free-for-all. Lords often played the role of medieval HR managers, ensuring equal distribution of the spoils, because nothing ruins morale like Greg from the infantry unit getting 3 swords while you're stuck with a rusty dagger. When Charlemagne defeated the Avars in the 8th century, he shared their massive treasure hoard with his men and the church. So basically, you could say it was the first recorded instance of both employee bonuses and tax deductions. Siege warfare was an essential part of medieval battles. But let's be real, it was mostly just an excuse to sit around and complain. Now, if you were a medieval soldier, arrows would be your worst nightmare. They came out of nowhere, ignored your fancy armor, and would obviously leave your wife without any action for the rest of her life. The longbow, in particular, was the medieval equivalent of a sniper rifle. English archers at battles like Agincourt and Crécy turned their enemies into medieval pincushions. The longbow had range, power, and speed, making it one of the most effective weapons of the era, until gunpowder showed up and basically made everyone rethink their life choices. Hollywood makes it seem like every medieval battle started with an inspiring speech. In reality, we have no idea what most battlefield speeches sounded like, because chroniclers just made them up later. King Stephen, for example, wasn't exactly known for his inspiring voice, so before the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, he outsourced the job to Baldwin, one of his nobles. Baldwin hyped up the troops, and then Stephen lost the battle and got captured. So much for motivational speaking. The most famous medieval speech, of course, is the one Shakespeare made up for Henry V in his play. The whole "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers" bit. Completely fictional, but hey, if you're going to have someone put words in your mouth, you might as well go with Shakespeare. Now, do you think you'd survive as a medieval soldier? If you like carrying your 350-pound wife, eating mouldy bread and dodging arrows every 5 minutes, this could have been the career for you. If not, well, maybe stick to video games and history documentaries instead. Let us know in the comments. And while you're at it, check out more of our weird history content, because nothing says quality entertainment like learning how people fought, looted, and occasionally tried to call in sick because they thought their boss was dead.